It was a quiet, almost deserted night near Washington. Veronica Caldwell was driving alone on the highway after leaving a secret meeting, typical for someone holding the high-ranking position of FBI director. She had not been in the role for long, but she was already respected for the determination and seriousness with which she approached every mission. The vehicle's speed remained strictly within the permitted limit, just enough to maintain her discretion and safety. Until then, everything seemed normal. An ordinary night, with the fatigue from hard work beginning to show in her alert gaze. Suddenly, red and blue lights cut through the darkness in her rearview mirror. Veronica frowned, intrigued. There was no reason for the police to stop her. Still, she remained calm and, following protocol exactly, parked the vehicle on the shoulder. Her breathing deepened as she watched through the mirror a local officer approach with heavy steps and a menacing posture. He was visibly nervous, and his hand rested dangerously close to his gun's handle. That was enough to trigger her highest alert. The officer, identified as Daniel Kearns by his partially illuminated badge, did not greet Veronica or explain the reason for the stop. Instead, he immediately demanded her driver's license and the vehicle's registration. His gruff, almost hostile voice echoed in the night's tranquility, awakening in Veronica a natural suspicion, a result of years of training and delicate professional experiences. Keeping calm and assertive, she handed over not only her personal documents, but also her FBI credentials, clearly stating her identity and position. Veronica expected an immediate change in the officer's behavior, a return to professional demeanor. However, nothing changed. Officer Kearns seemed immune to the weight of the information in his hands, as if determined to completely ignore who she was, or worse, to openly defy her. The situation became even tenser when Kearns, ignoring basic protocol, brusquely demanded that she exit the car. It was an unjustified order, a clearly abusive and intimidating action. The request raised a red flag in Veronica's trained mind. She knew that something was deeply wrong in that nighttime encounter on the empty highway. Despite the fear of worsening the situation, she could not simply comply without questioning, as that would mean accepting a clear violation of her rights and professional ethics. With firm yet controlled tone, ensuring no dangerous escalation, Veronica directly asked why she was being ordered to leave the vehicle, demanding a concrete justification for such a drastic action. Kearns did not provide detailed explanations, limiting himself to vaguely stating that she had exhibited suspicious behavior. The absurd accusation made her immediately realize that she was not dealing with a simple police stop. Something much more dangerous was at stake, something that went beyond what normally happened in standard encounters. At that critical moment, a second police vehicle arrived on the scene, further increasing the risk. The unexpected reinforcement did not bring comfort or safety. On the contrary, it exacerbated the threat looming over Veronica Caldwell. From the second police car, a tall and strong man stepped out, the officer who, in theory, should help clarify the situation. However, he did not even assess the scene or question Kearns about the reasons for the stop. Instead, he immediately positioned himself next to his colleague, reinforcing the already established oppressive dynamic. His presence seemed coordinated, almost rehearsed, which confirmed Veronica's suspicions that this was not a casual encounter, but something deeply troubling. The tension increased exponentially when the second officer, without hesitation, also ordered her out of the vehicle, repeating exactly the harsh and unjustified words of Kearns. Veronica clearly felt that, at that moment, she was not seen as a federal authority or even as an ordinary citizen. To them, she was simply a person to be dominated and intimidated. This perception brought about a sense of powerlessness that she had rarely experienced in her professional life, where she usually controlled all the variables. Feeling cornered and aware of the risks she faced, Veronica quickly assessed her options. She knew that openly resisting could lead to a tragic outcome, especially considering the clearly aggressive attitude of the officers. On the other hand, submitting without resistance could put her even more in danger, isolated in the hands of two officers who had already shown willingness to ignore basic procedures. Every second now mattered. With the cold composure of someone who had faced countless critical situations before, Veronica finally decided to exit the vehicle, doing so slowly and deliberately so as not to provide any excuse that could justify greater aggression. As she set her feet on the ground, the unexpected happened. Kearns violently grabbed her wrist, falsely accusing her of resistance. The sharp pain in her arm made it clear that this was not just psychological intimidation, but the actual beginning of physical assault. The other officer quickly confirmed over the radio that they had a non-cooperative suspect, reinforcing a false and dangerous narrative. For Veronica, the situation was completely spiraling out of control, showing how even someone with her power and position could be reduced to a defenseless victim in the face of brute force and institutional abuse. As the situation rapidly worsened, Veronica felt her heart race. Officer Kearns' aggressive stance became even more dangerous when, in a sudden and threatening gesture, he reached for his gun. The movement was not only intimidating, it was a clear warning of the level of threat she was facing. In her entire career, Veronica had never felt so vulnerable in the face of such evident abuse of power. With her hands raised in a calculated sign of submission, she tried to maintain composure and clarity of thought, knowing that any wrong move could have fatal consequences. She realized that Kearns was seeking even the slightest justification to act violently, something that could later be manipulated to blame her. Veronica kept her gaze firm but cautious, studying every small movement of the officer, trying to anticipate his next steps in order to neutralize the situation without bloodshed. At that decisive moment, an unexpected voice broke the tense silence of the dark highway. "Hey, I'm recording all of this!" The shout came from a young man who had parked further ahead, partially hidden by the night's shadow. The faint glow from his cell phone screen immediately revealed that he was recording the event, indisputable proof of the truth. The introduction of this new element instantly changed the dynamics of the moment. The second officer, startled, diverted his gaze to the young man and advanced threateningly in his direction, determined to stop the recording. Veronica, realizing the risk the young man faced by trying to help, reacted quickly. Using all the authority her position conferred upon her, she raised her voice and ordered the officers to immediately cease any action against the witness. The firmness and clarity in her tone caught the officers by surprise, forcing them to hesitate for the first time since the confrontation began. For the first time that night, Veronica felt that she was regaining some of the control she had lost minutes earlier. The young man, even though his hands trembled slightly, continued recording everything, aware that his act could be decisive in ensuring justice. In that exact moment, she realized that without that courageous intervention, she might not have been able to reverse the situation that seemed destined for tragedy. In the distance, the sound of sirens announced the arrival of additional police reinforcements. Under normal circumstances, that would have been a relief for someone in Veronica's position, but that night, it represented even more uncertainty and danger. She did not know if these new officers would act professionally or if they would reinforce the hostile attitude of Kearns and his partner. Her breathing quickened as the vehicles rapidly approached, casting intense lights over the chaotic scene at the roadside. Officer Kearns, still pointing his gun in a threatening manner, clearly showed signs of discomfort at the new scenario. Veronica noticed his nervousness as he heard the arrival of the patrol cars, indicating that he might not be prepared to justify his actions before colleagues who were not involved in that scheme. Even so, he kept his gun steady, appearing determined to continue his narrative of intimidation until the very last second. The new officers quickly emerged from their vehicles, approaching with caution, not fully understanding the situation. One of them, an older and experienced lieutenant, immediately recognized Veronica. His expression of surprise and shock upon identifying her as the FBI director said it all. He pronounced her name loudly and clearly, erasing any doubt about her identity. At that exact moment, the dynamics of the encounter changed radically. The newly arrived officers positioned themselves beside Veronica, immediately assuming a posture of respect and acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. The lieutenant, realizing that something very wrong had occurred, directly questioned Officer Kearns about the reason for such an aggressive and unjustified stop. For the first time that night, Kearns hesitated, his gaze revealing the growing desperation as he realized he had completely lost control over what had once seemed so easy and secure. The officer who moments ago had appeared so powerful and threatening now seemed cornered and insecure, incapable of coherently explaining his extreme actions. Meanwhile, Veronica could still feel adrenaline pulsing in her veins, aware that she had just experienced an instance of blatant and deep abuse. A situation that would leave permanent marks not only on her, but also on everyone involved that dark night. Realizing that she finally had the backing of the other officers present, Veronica wasted no time. With her security partially restored, she used her federal authority to order the immediate arrest of Kearns and his partner, making it clear that this was not merely a personal matter, but a serious violation of police procedures. The present lieutenant hesitated for a brief moment, not out of doubt about the legitimacy of the order, but due to the shock of having to act against fellow officers. However, given the undeniable gravity of what had happened and Veronica's uncontestable authority, he quickly signaled the other officers, who advanced to arrest Kearns. The officer, once so full of arrogance and certainty, now wore an expression of absolute disbelief, as if he were facing something unthinkable, something he had never imagined could happen to him. His partner, equally disconcerted, offered no resistance, clearly showing that he had not foreseen this outcome. As the two officers were handcuffed and led to the patrol cars under the watchful eyes of the other officers, Veronica immediately requested a full investigation into the incident. She did not limit herself to demanding only superficial explanations. She insisted on unrestricted access to the involved officers' disciplinary and professional records, in addition to the immediate involvement of the Internal Affairs Department. From her experience, she knew that situations like this were not isolated events, but symptoms of much deeper problems, deeply rooted within the police institution. While waiting for the investigation to progress, her attention turned to the young man who had recorded everything with his cell phone, still standing nearby, watching the events unfold intently. Veronica approached him, thanking him for the courage and civic awareness he had demonstrated in such a delicate moment. The young man, visibly emotional and still trembling a little, simply replied that he did what he thought was right. For Veronica, those simple words carried immense significance, reminding her that justice often depended on the courage of ordinary people. In that moment, she realized that the unexpected encounter on the empty road had not only exposed a serious police failure, but also revealed something deeply human: the importance of never looking away from an injustice, regardless of the risk or fear involved. A few hours after that disturbing roadside encounter, the images recorded by the young witness began circulating on the internet. The video quickly went viral on social media and across various media outlets, generating an immense wave of public outrage. The footage was clear and forceful, showing not only the unjustified attempt of aggression against Veronica, but also exposing a worrisome pattern of behavior by the involved officers. Now in her office at the FBI building, Veronica closely monitored the repercussions while reading preliminary reports on the officers' backgrounds. It became clear to her, as she carefully analyzed those documents, that Kearns had previously accumulated several complaints related to similar abuses, almost always dismissed without serious consequences. His partner, on the other hand, although with a less explicit record, had clearly learned to remain silent and cooperate with the abuses committed by his more experienced colleague. A feeling of indignation overtook her once again, reinforcing the importance of firm and exemplary action. As dawn broke, public pressure increased drastically. Veronica received countless phone calls from important political figures, representatives of the Department of Justice, and social activists demanding concrete measures. What had happened the previous night had surpassed the personal sphere. It had become a powerful symbol of a long-neglected structural problem. The rapid public reaction showed her that many other victims, without enough voice or power to defend themselves, had suffered similar abuses and remained forgotten or silenced. This further increased her sense of responsibility and determination to carry the investigation to its ultimate conclusion, not only to deliver justice in her specific case, but also to shed light on all similar situations. Veronica immediately convened a special FBI team to conduct a rigorous inquiry, ensuring that no evidence would be ignored or suppressed by internal bureaucracy. In a short time, the gravity and relevance of that incident transformed into an exemplary case, capable of redefining ethical and operational standards within the police force, and perhaps altering the fate of many innocent people who might one day find themselves in similar circumstances. The local police's response was predictable. An official statement full of generic phrases mentioning that the case would be taken seriously and that the circumstances were still being investigated. To Veronica, that was nothing more than a reflection of the culture of impunity that allowed cases like this to continue happening. The difference this time was that there was irrefutable evidence and a victim with enough power to demand justice. Media pressure and public opinion made it impossible to cover up the case. In less than 24 hours, the police chief was forced to hold a press conference announcing that Kearns had been suspended from duty pending the investigation's conclusion and that his partner was also removed. But Veronica knew that this was not enough. The suspension was only a temporary measure. The real challenge was ensuring that it resulted in real punishments and structural changes within the system. As the investigation progressed, the details revealed were even more disturbing than Veronica had imagined. Records showed that Kearns had been reported more than a dozen times for violent stops and abuse of power, always against citizens he considered vulnerable. The files were full of clear patterns: victims without influence, without means to defend themselves, often without witnesses or recordings that could prove their versions. What happened to Veronica was not an isolated mistake. It was part of a cycle of abusive power that had been ignored for years. Now, however, he had made the mistake of acting against someone who could not be silenced. For the first time, his record could no longer be swept under the rug. The mixture of relief and frustration surged within her. Relief because the truth was finally coming to light, and frustration because, had it not been for a twist of fate, Kearns would have continued his impunity, accumulating more victims along the way. Veronica knew that her position gave her the privilege to fight this effectively, but she also thought about how many others never had that chance. That thought deeply troubled her and reinforced her decision to pursue the case to its ultimate conclusion. The reactions to the case's exposure were immediate and intense. The public took to the streets in peaceful protests, holding signs demanding justice not only for Veronica, but for all victims of abusive stops. Newspaper headlines and television programs dissected every detail of the investigation, recalling other similar cases in which the abuse of authority went unpunished. Daniel Kearns's name became synonymous with police corruption, a reminder of how power, when unchecked, could transform into a tool of oppression. Meanwhile, Veronica remained focused on the investigation. The final report, produced by a team of highly qualified federal agents, was irrefutable. Kearns and his partner had violated numerous protocols, disrespected civil rights, and used force unjustifiably. The evidence was handed directly to the Department of Justice, ensuring that the case would be handled at the highest levels of the legal system. It was a significant step, but Veronica knew the battle was far from over. If she wanted real changes, she needed to ensure that this case became a precedent, a symbol of accountability for all who wore a badge. The final decision came a few days later. Kearns was formally charged with assault, abuse of authority, and threatening a federal officer with a firearm. His partner, although not having initiated the confrontation, was held accountable for complicity and negligence. Both were dismissed from the police force even before trial, a rare outcome in cases like this. Veronica received the news in her office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and a heavy weight on her shoulders. She had won an important battle, but she was not naive. This was not a definitive victory against the systemic problem that allowed such abuses to occur. As she looked out the window, observing the busy streets below, she thought of the young man who had filmed the incident. He wasn't a police officer. He had no power whatsoever. But his simple decision to record everything had completely changed the course of events. Without him, perhaps Kearns would have once again walked free. It was then that Veronica's phone rang. On the other end of the line, the young man's voice sounded timid but firm. "I just wanted to say I did what anyone would do." Veronica smiled slightly before replying, "You did what many wouldn't have the courage to do." For the first time since that night on the road, she felt a genuine glimpse of hope. In the following days, the impact of the case continued to reverberate throughout the country. The video of the stop circulated incessantly, and public pressure forced numerous political and police leaders to take a stand. The mayor of the city where Kearns worked held a press conference to announce a complete review of stop protocols and the creation of an independent commission to investigate abuses within the force. For many, this appeared to be nothing more than empty rhetoric, a way to calm public opinion without guaranteeing real changes. But for Veronica, every small action represented progress. Even if the institutional culture was resistant, the exposure of that case had shed a spotlight on a problem that had long remained in the shadows. And once the light was on, it could not be so easily turned off again. However, the exposure also brought unexpected challenges. Veronica began receiving anonymous threats, messages insinuating that she had betrayed the police by exposing their agents to justice. Some emails and phone calls were clear in their intent to intimidate her, suggesting that her safety might be at risk. But she did not back down. She knew she was challenging a system that for years had operated without question, protecting those who abused power without fear of punishment. If they tried to silence her, it was because they were afraid of what might happen next, and that meant her fight was working. With the same composure she had shown when confronting Kearns that night, Veronica took measures to bolster her security, but without straying from her mission. It was not the first time she had dealt with threats, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The difference now was that she knew she was not alone. The public was watching. The eyes of the country were focused on this fight. And as long as there was someone willing to hold a camera, to record a decisive moment, to tell the truth without fear, there was a real chance for change. With the official investigation closed and charges formalized, Veronica's case not only exposed a structural problem within the police, but also triggered concrete changes. A few weeks after the incident, she was called to a Senate hearing where she had to recount her experience in detail. Sitting before senators, reporters, and cameras broadcasting live to the entire country, Veronica described the stop, the abuse, and the real danger she faced that night. But what impacted people the most was not just what happened to her, but the fact that it could have happened to anyone. "If this happened to me, an FBI director, imagine what happens to people who have no means to defend themselves," she said during her testimony. The absolute silence in the chamber confirmed the weight of her words. In that moment, Veronica knew that her voice had reached far beyond that courtroom. She was paving the way for a national conversation that could no longer be ignored. The hearing was a turning point. With media and public pressure, Congress announced a plan to review police training protocols and increase oversight of cases of abuse of authority. The Department of Justice also committed to re-examining thousands of complaints filed against officers across the country, many of them similar to those on Kearns' disciplinary record. For the first time in a long while, there seemed to be a real movement toward accountability. For Veronica, however, the greatest impact did not come from political changes or official speeches, but from the messages she began receiving from people who had experienced similar situations and never got justice. Letters, emails, and even phone calls from strangers arrived daily. Some messages came from families of victims who did not have a camera to prove their innocence, others from ordinary citizens thanking her for her courage in exposing something that had long been denied. Each of these messages reinforced what she already knew. This fight was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who in some way had been silenced. And now, finally, they were being heard. Over the weeks that followed, the case stopped being just a headline and became part of a broader discussion. The impact of that night's recording was not limited to the trial of Kearns and his partner. It triggered a wave of awareness about using technology as a tool for justice. Civil rights organizations began encouraging citizens to record police stops whenever they felt unsafe. Apps were developed specifically to transmit recordings directly to secure databases, preventing evidence from being erased or manipulated. Veronica observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and responsibility. Her case had become a symbol of resistance, but she knew that the fight was only just beginning. Every small change was a step in the right direction, yet much remained to be done to ensure that what happened to her that night would never happen to anyone else. Despite the sense of progress, Veronica was not naive. She knew that real change takes time and requires persistence. The system was slow, bureaucratic, and often resistant to any attempt at reform. But she also knew that after that night on the road, something within her had changed forever. Her perception of her own power and responsibility would never be the same. Before, she saw her position as FBI director as a means to ensure security in major operations and combat high-level crimes. Now she understood that her influence should also be used for something even greater, to ensure that justice was not a privilege accessible only to a few, but an inalienable right for everyone. A stranger's camera had prevented a tragedy, and if a single recording could change a story, imagine how many other injustices could be prevented if people never again turned a blind eye to what was happening around them. Veronica Caldwell's case was never just about a night of confrontation with the police. It was about a system that allowed abuses of power to be perpetuated without question, about a country that was finally beginning to open its eyes to the injustices hidden in plain sight. As the investigation continued to reveal more layers of corruption and abuse within the police forces, Veronica remained steadfast, knowing that her mission was far from over. True change would not come from a single case or one person, but through collective awareness and constant action by everyone willing to keep their eyes open. When she answered the phone for the last time a few weeks after the trial, the young man who had filmed her stop spoke in a clear and firm voice. "I knew what I did was right, but after everything that happened, I can see how much it matters." Veronica smiled with a renewed sense of hope. "Yes," she replied. "Now, we all know." And for the first time in a long while, Veronica felt that the fight for justice was not lost. She was no longer alone, and neither were all the others who, with courage, chose to do what was right without fear of facing power. The fight for truth would continue, but she now knew that even in the darkest moments, there was always someone willing to shine the light of truth.